Company Flight 789 Aerolux had just taken off from Charles de Gaulle Airport, heading for New York. The sky was clear, a canvas of infinite blue that stretched as far as the eye could see, creating a feeling of freedom and tranquility. The cabin was cozy, elegant, like a bubble isolated from the outside world. Most passengers relaxed, as if they were already at their destination, lost in the gentle air conditioning and the absolute comfort of the padded leather seats. These armchairs, so carefully arranged, invited intimacy. Their headrests were luxuriously padded, and the polished wooden armrests gleamed in the dim lighting. The plane, a Boeing 787 Dreamliner, was a technological marvel, with its clean lines and modern design. The interior lighting changed delicately, alternating between soft tones of blue and orange, to adapt to the time of day and the atmosphere we wanted to create. The small lamps on the ceiling seemed to hang like stars. In this cozy atmosphere, the passengers all seemed to lose themselves in their personal world. Some were immersed in books or magazines, absorbed by distant stories or economic analyses. Others were tapping away on their laptops, sending urgent emails or putting finishing touches on presentations. And then, there were those who completely let themselves go, reclining their seats as far as possible, closing their eyes to savor a moment of peace and luxury, a rare parenthesis in their busy lives. Leah, a young 27-year-old flight attendant, had never imagined that one day she could be part of this universe, there, in first class, among these high-ranking passengers. She had been serving in economy class for several years, juggling between pressing requests and distracted glances. That morning, however, his dream had come true. She had been assigned to first-class service for her very first flight. The company Aerolux, known for her impeccable service, expected a perfect performance from her. The weight of responsibility weighed on her shoulders, and she felt the immensity of the opportunity before her. Every gesture, every smile had to be impeccable. She had been preparing all week for this moment, reviewing procedures, rehearsing every move in her head to avoid the slightest misstep. However, as is often the case, the reality was very different from the anticipated perfection. The first hours of the flight had passed without any major incident, but Leah couldn't help but feel constantly on alert. She wasn't completely comfortable yet. She wondered if every movement she made was being observed, judged. Then, as the minutes passed, she began to breathe a little more freely. Maybe she had too much pressure, too much fear of making a mistake. She told herself that perhaps she was too tense, that she overestimated herself. She smiled more naturally, chatted a little more with the passengers, and everything seemed to be going well. It was then that she walked towards a man sitting in one of the central seats of the cabin. He was around 50 years old, dressed in a very elegant dark suit, his shirt perfectly ironed, his tie carefully adjusted. He seemed absorbed in his financial book, his eyes immersed in the figures and graphs. Leah first noticed him by his tranquility, this implacable aura that emanated from him. He wasn't one to talk. He was the epitome of a successful businessman, the kind of passenger who expected perfect service without being loud. Leah approached with her tray, which contained hot drinks and some fine pastries. She watched over every movement, every detail. She tried not to drop a single coffee bean, to bring the cup without spilling a drop. As the flight entered a slight area of turbulence, Leah felt the plane shake slightly. It was nothing more than a small jolt, but for her, it was enough to cause the balance she was trying to maintain to falter. The coffee cup, placed on the tray, tilted slightly. Time seemed to slow down, every movement suddenly becoming exaggerated, every detail larger. Before she could react, the coffee, hot and bubbling, spilled. The black liquid poured out slowly, almost with a gentle brutality, like in a slow-motion movie, spreading across the face of the man in front of her. He didn't have time to react before the coffee hit him. An unexpected shock. Leah felt her heart racing. A cry of surprise, followed by immediate panic, escaped his lips. The passengers, some of whom had already noticed the incident, stopped their activities, their eyes turning towards the stewardess. Murmurs arose in the cabin, while Leah, frozen, no longer knew where to stand. The man in the suit closed his eyes briefly from the heat, but instead of the angry outburst she feared, He remained surprisingly calm. No grimace of pain, no cry, nothing. He wiped his face slowly, with an almost disconcerting serenity. Leah, trembling, almost knelt before him, apologizing 1,000 times. She felt like everything was collapsing around her. How could she have made such a mistake in front of such an imposing man? He belonged to that silent elite of passengers who always seemed to expect something more, always waiting for perfect service. She expected reproaches, demands for compensation, or even a complaint. But he did none of that. He simply raised a hand, gesturing gently to let the crew know that there was no need to make a big deal out of it. "It's nothing," he said, in a soft but firm, almost paternalistic voice. "It's just a little coffee. I'm sure there's nothing you can do about it." Leah couldn't believe it. How could he remain so implacable, so calm after such embarrassment? His thoughts raced through his head, clashing between gratitude and guilt. He was a man clearly used to getting whatever he wanted, and she didn't know whether to be relieved or even more nervous. Part of her felt like a child caught at fault, while another, more reasonable part understood that this man didn't want a spectacle. But within her, the embarrassment was great, and she feared that this incident would mark the end of her budding first-class career. She wondered if she would receive a warning, or worse, a public reprimand. But instead, the man just smiled slightly. "I'm fine, don't worry. But maybe a little cooler coffee would be a good idea next time," he added soothingly, his voice calm and measured, as if the incident was just another detail among many. It offered a glimmer of hope, a thread of humanity in a moment that could have turned into total humiliation. Leah, still in shock from the situation, didn't really know how to react. She nodded mechanically, her gaze shifting, unable to sustain the intensity of the attention he was giving her. She hurried away, her mind whirling. Was this incident really going to cost him his job? The question gnawed at her, obsessively. She knew she had made an unforgivable mistake, but this man, this client, he was not like the others. His words weren't harsh or accusatory, but they left her with a bitter taste of guilt. She could already imagine the discussions behind the scenes, the whispers from colleagues about her mistakes. A simple misstep could be enough to destroy a stewardess career. The hours dragged on and Leah tried to concentrate on her other passengers. But her mind was elsewhere, absorbed by the image of this man in a suit, his piercing eyes, his Olympian calm which seemed to scrutinize her every movement. The plane began its descent toward the New York airport, but the pressure inside it continued to build. What was he going to do? Was he going to tell the superiors about the incident? She knew that a man of his status undoubtedly had the means to bring down an employee. He hadn't shown any signs of anger, but she couldn't help but think that perhaps the apparent indifference hid an immense underlying anger. When the plane hit the tarmac, Leah tried to compose herself, but her gaze fell on a scene she never would have imagined. Black limousines were parked around the plane, luxury cars surrounded the plane, and a squad of men in suits stood straight on the ground, motionless, a sort of silent, imposing formation. The setting seemed unreal, almost cinematic. What was going on? She thought, confused. Then, the man in question slowly stood up. He adjusted his coat with disconcerting elegance before heading towards the plane door. Leah followed him with her eyes, still not understanding the scene that was unfolding before her eyes. The crew, whom she had seen earlier in a state of mild panic, now stood straight, almost solemn, as if a new authority had just been imposed. The smiles of respect and deference they gave him as they passed only amplified his discomfort. One of the directors of the company, a man with an austere but benevolent demeanor, came forward with a marked smile on his face. "Mr. Delacroix, we are delighted to welcome you to New York," he said in a voice full of respect. Leah, stunned, couldn't believe what she had just heard. Delacroix? This name meant something to him, like a familiar resonance. And then, suddenly, the truth hit her right in the heart. Antoine Delacroix, the name she had heard on everyone's lips in the corporate corridors, the owner of the airline she worked for. The man she had accidentally doused in coffee was the man who ran the colossal fortune of Aerolux. A cold shiver ran through her. She had just spilled coffee on the boss, the most powerful of them. Blood rushed to her head, but before she could react, he was already out of her reach, walking away with dignity, surrounded by the aura of power he embodied. She felt small, tiny, in the shadow of this man who didn't even seem to have taken offense. She headed toward the crew office, her mind a whirlwind of anxiety. She didn't even dare imagine the confrontation to come, the harsh reprimand she was about to receive. But to his surprise, this was not the case. A few minutes later, Antoine Delacroix passed by her again. His steps slow, measured, imbued with the quiet authority that characterized him. He looked into her eyes, a slight smile playing on his lips. "Mademoiselle, next time, perhaps the coffee will have to be a little more behaved. But thank you for your professionalism, even after the incident. You handled the situation well. I will remember it." Leah remained speechless, totally stunned by his words. She didn't even have time to respond. Antoine Delacroix got into one of the limousines waiting for him, his departure as imposing as his presence. The engines roared with a dull noise as the cars sped away, taking with them the strange feeling of this moment that would change his outlook on life. She stood there, motionless, her mind in turmoil. She had just experienced a lesson in grandeur, but not the one she expected. There were no complaints, no threats of dismissal, nothing she had feared. On the contrary, he had shown her immense dignity, a form of kindness that she would never have imagined from a man of his power. He had chosen to be gracious, to grant this human error the same humanity. Leah then understood something fundamental. True greatness did not lie in money or social status. It lay in the ability to face a situation calmly, to treat others with respect, even when they made a mistake. That day, she met a man whose greatness went far beyond simply running a business. She had seen in his attitude the true measure of power, that of choosing dignity, whatever the situation.